Finding what appears to be a simple piece of jewelry leads to a deeper understanding of his maid's past. The necklace holds secrets that transform his perception of wealth and worth. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The chandeliers cast golden light across Thomas Caldwell's marble floors as laughter echoed through his mansion. Another Friday night, another gathering of Silicon Valley's elite. Thomas stood near the grand staircase, swirling an untouched glass of 30-year-old scotch, watching his guests compete in their usual game of one-upmanship. Just closed another Series B, announced Marcus Chun, a venture capitalist Thomas had known since college. $200 million. The startup's developing AI for autonomous yachts. He paused for effect, scanning the small circle of listeners. Anyone want it on the next round? Thomas suppressed a yawn. These conversations had become predictable. Funding rounds, property acquisitions, new toys. Even the excited chatter about space tourism ventures felt stale. He'd made his fortune in biotech 10 years ago, but success hadn't brought the fulfillment he'd expected. Thomas, didn't you just buy that island off the coast of Thailand? Someone called out, but Thomas had already started drifting away from the group, seeking quiet. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the sounds of the party became muffled. In the east wing, he noticed light spilling from one of the guest rooms. Lyla, his housekeeper of 5 years, was methodically cleaning despite the late hour. Thomas paused at the doorway. Lyla always insisted on working during parties, saying it was easier to clean when she could see how guests used the spaces. She moved with practiced efficiency, her dark hands smoothing the Egyptian cotton sheets with careful precision. "Lyla, you don't have to do this now," Thomas said, stepping into the room. "The party's still going." She looked up startled. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm almost finished here." She tucked a loose strand of hair back in her neat bun and continued working. That's when Thomas saw it. As Lyla reached across the bed, something slipped from her neck, landing silently on the plush carpet. A necklace. The pendant caught the light strangely, seeming to pulse with an inner glow that didn't match the room's chandelier. Thomas bent to retrieve it before Lyla noticed its absence. The metal was warm to his touch, and intricate patterns were carved into its surface, patterns that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. "Lyla," he called, holding up the necklace. "I think you dropped this." She turned, and her usual composed expression faltered. Her hand flew to her throat, finding it bare. "Oh!" The word came out barely above a whisper. She reached for the necklace, but Thomas found himself reluctant to let it go. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," he said, studying the pendant more closely. "I've never seen anything quite like it. Where did you get it?" Lyla stood very still, her hands clasped together. The distant sounds of the party faded away as tension filled the room. "It was my grandmother's," she finally said, her voice carrying a weight Thomas had never heard before. "Your grandmother's?" Thomas prompted, sensing there was more to the story. Lyla seemed to debate with herself before speaking again. "She wore it during the Freedom Rides. It's been in my family since." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "It's very important to me, Mr. Caldwell." Thomas looked at the necklace with new eyes. The pattern suddenly seemed less mysterious and more meaningful. Symbols of heritage and resistance he'd never learned to recognize. He handed it back carefully, watching as Lyla secured it around her neck with practiced movements. "Would you tell me more about it?" he asked, surprising himself with his genuine curios. "Ity." Lyla's fingers lingered on the pendant. "It's a long story, Mr. Caldwell, and not an easy one." From downstairs, someone called Thomas's name, probably wondering where their host had disappeared to. But for the first time that evening, Thomas felt truly engaged. "I'd like to hear it, if you're willing to share." In that moment, standing in the quiet guest room while his wealthy friends continued their celebrations below, Thomas felt the first stirring of change. Though he couldn't yet know how this simple necklace would reshape his understanding of both his present and his past. The Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center stood in stark contrast to Thomas's usual haunts. The two-story brick building had seen better days, but its walls spoke volumes. A massive mural stretched across the entire facade, depicting faces and scenes from the civil rights movement alongside more recent community leaders. Thomas parked his Tesla, feeling conspicuously out of place. He'd tracked down the center's address after his conversation with Lyla, learning it was where she'd spent much of her youth. The necklace's mystery had gnawed at him all week, disrupting his usually efficient workdays with unexpected thoughts about history and heritage. Inside, the building hummed with activity. Children darted through the halls, their sneakers squeaking on the worn linoleum. Senior citizens gathered around card tables, their animated conversations filling the air. Nobody paid much attention to Thomas, despite his tailored suit and obvious discomfort. The mural continued inside, wrapping around the main hall. Thomas found himself drawn to a particular section that showed a group of women marching, their faces set with determination. One of them wore a necklace that looked remarkably similar to Lyla's. "That's the Women's March of '63, a deep voice said behind him. "Those ladies changed everything around here." Thomas turned to find an elderly man watching him with keen interest. The man's name tag identified him as Dr. James Wilson, community director. "I'm interested in learning about a necklace," Thomas said, gesturing to the mural. "One that looks just like that one." Dr. Wilson's expression shifted from polite interest to intense focus. "You've seen one of the liberation pendants?" He stepped closer to the mural, running his hand along the painted figure's neck. There were only 12 made. Each one went to a different leader in our community. Libération pendant? They were more than jewelry, Dr. Wilson explained, leading Thomas to his office. The small room was cramped with books and photographs, every surface telling another piece of history. Those necklaces were symbols of resistance. The women who wore them organized protests, ran underground schools, created safe houses. They knew the pendants marked them as targets, but they wore them proudly. Thomas thought about how carefully Lyla handled her necklace. "One of my employees, Lyla Johnson, has one. It was her grandmother's." Dr. Wilson's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, Margaret Johnson's granddaughter. Margaret was something else. Taught children to read in her basement when the schools were still segregated. She wore that pendant every day until she passed." Thomas sat heavily in a worn office chair, his mind racing. "I had no idea. Lyla's worked for me for 5 years, and I never knew any of this." "Most people don't know their own histories, let alone others," Dr. Wilson said, pulling out an old photo album. "Look here." The photograph showed scenes from the center's early days. Thomas leaned forward, studying the faces of people who'd fought for basic rights he'd always taken for granted. Something about their expressions reminded him of stories his father used to tell about their family's arrival in America. "My grandparents were immigrants," Thomas found himself saying. "They came here with nothing. My grandfather worked 3 jobs until he could open his own store." Dr. Wilson nodded. "Struggle comes in many forms, Mr. Caldwell." Thomas Caldwell. The old man paused, a strange expression crossing his face. "Caldwell? Any relation to Henry Caldwell?" "That was my father's name," Thomas said, surprised. "He left when I was young. I don't know much about him." Dr. Wilson said nothing for a long moment, then turned to his filing cabinet. "I think there's something you should see." He rifled through folders before pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This might change how you see things." The article showed a younger Dr. Wilson standing with a group of community leaders. And there, in the back row, was a face Thomas hadn't seen in 20 years, his father, Henry Caldwell. "Your father helped establish this center," Dr. Wilson said quietly. "He was one of our strongest allies during some very tough times." Thomas stared at the photograph, his understanding of his own history shifting like sand under his feet. His father, whom he'd always assumed had abandoned them for a new life somewhere, had been here all along, fighting for something bigger than himself. "I don't understand," Thomas said. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" "Sometimes the stories we don't hear shape us as much as the ones we do," Dr. Wilson replied. "Your father had his reasons, but maybe it's time you learned about them." Thomas left the center that afternoon with more questions than answers. The weight of discovery pressed against his chest, not just about Lyla's necklace or his father's secret life, but about his own place in a history he'd never fully understood. As he drove home, the faces from the mural stayed with him, including that unnamed woman with the pendant. He thought about Lyla, quietly carrying this legacy while cleaning his mansion. He thought about his father, whose absence suddenly held new meaning. And he thought about his own life, built on a foundation he was only now beginning to see clearly. That evening, Thomas found Lyla organizing the pantry. He'd spent hours driving around after leaving the community center, trying to process everything he'd learned. Now, watching her methodically arrange canned goods, he saw her through new eyes. "Lyla, could we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Something in his expression must have signaled the shift in their dynamic. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell." They sat at the kitchen island, a first in their 5-year working relationship. Thomas had never before invited her to sit with him, and the realization made him uncomfortable. "I visited the Martin Luther King Jr. Center today," he said directly. "I met Dr. Wilson." Lyla's fingers went to her necklace, a gesture Thomas now recognized as both protective and grounding. "I see. He told me about your grandmother, Margaret, about what she did for the community." Thomas paused. "I'd like to hear more from you, if you're willing to share." Lyla was quiet for a long moment. "Why now, Mr. Caldwell?" The question struck him like a physical blow. Why had it taken him 5 years to ask about her life? "Because I've been blind," he admitted, "and I'm trying to see clearly now." Something in his honesty seemed to reach her. Lyla reached in her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was my mother's," she said, placing it on the counter between them. "She wrote about everything, the protests, the threats, the victories. About raising me alone while fighting for our rights." She opened the journal to a dog-eared page. Here's what she wrote the day she lost her job for organizing a union. Her voice took on a different tone as she read. "Today they took my paycheck, but they can't take my dignity." Lyla watched me clean out my desk. I saw fear in her eyes, but I want her to see strength in mine. "We ate beans for dinner, but we ate them with pride." Tomas Vistenidas Lyla Conchi. Yid reading. Stories poured out of her mother working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, of community members sharing what little they had, of victories that came at great personal cost. The journal documented not just struggle, but resilience, love, and unwavering determination. "My mother died last year," Lyla said, closing the journal. "Cancer. She couldn't afford proper treatment until it was too late." Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "I took this job to pay off her medical bills. That's why I work every party, every holiday. I'm almost there." Thomas felt shame flood through him, remembering all the times he'd casually spent more on wine for a single dinner party than Lyla made in a month. "I had no idea. Most people don't want to know," Lyla said simply. "They prefer their help invisible, silent." "Like I did," Thomas acknowledged. Lyla nodded, but without judgment. "You know what my mother wrote the day she gave me this necklace?" She opened the journal to the last page. "Remember, baby girl, this pendant isn't just jewelry. It's a promise that we keep fighting, keep pushing forward, keep believing in better days. Wear it proud." Thomas thought about his own mother, who'd raised him alone after his father left. She'd never told him why Henry disappeared, had never spoken badly of him. Now he wondered what other silences in his life held untold stories. "I grew up thinking I was self-made," Thomas said, the words coming slowly. "That everything I achieved was through my own merit. But sitting here, listening to your story, I'm realizing how much I've taken for granted. How many doors were already open for me, while others had to break them down." Lyla studied him for a moment. "Recognition is a start, Mr. Caldwell, but it's what you do with that recognition that matters." "Please," he said, "call me Thomas." She smiled slightly, but shook her head. "Not yet. We're not there yet." Her honesty was refreshing, even if it stung. Thomas respected her for maintaining boundaries while still sharing her truth. He looked at the journal between them, thinking about the stories it contained and the countless others that went unrecorded. "Would you tell me more?" he asked. "About your mother, your grandmother, the community? I want to understand." "Understanding takes time," Lyla warned. "And some stories aren't easy to hear." "I'm ready to listen," Thomas replied, meaning it more than any promise he'd made in recent memory. The check in Thomas's hand represented more money than he typically spent on a weekend getaway, but for the first time in his life, he felt uncertain about giving money away. Not because of the amount, but because he wanted it to matter, to help in the right way. He'd spent a week researching the community center's needs after his conversations with Lyla and Dr. Wilson. The building needed repairs. Their after-school programs were underfunded, and their computer lab was running on decade-old machines. His initial impulse had been to write a check large enough to solve everything at once. But Lyla's words about recognition versus action kept echoing in his mind. Finally, he'd settled on a focused donation, enough to renovate the computer lab and fund a coding program for local youth. It felt like a concrete step rather than just throwing money at a problem. "You're doing what?" Marcus Chen's voice carried across Thomas's pool deck, where a smaller gathering of his usual circle had assembled for Sunday brunch. Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. "I'm donating to the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center. They're doing important work." "Since when do you care about community centers?" Sarah Whitman, a hedge fund manager, laughed. "Don't tell me you're having some kind of midlife crisis. First you skipped the Hamptons weekend, now this." "You should be careful with that sort of thing," Marcus added, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "These organizations, they're never satisfied. Give them a finger, they'll take the whole hand. Next thing you know, they'll be expecting regular donations." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "These organizations," he repeated slowly, "are helping people who genuinely need it. People who work hard every day just to survive." "Oh, please," Sarah rolled her eyes. "Everyone has the same opportunities these days. If they're not succeeding, it's because they're not trying hard enough." From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw Lyla entering the house through the side door, presumably to start her Sunday cleaning routine. He wondered if she could hear the conversation. "That's not true," Thomas said, his voice firm. "And I think you know it's not true. Don't tell me your housekeeper's been filling your head with sob stories." Marcus snorted. "What's next? Will you be marching in protests? Demanding reparations?" Several others laughed, but the sound grated against Thomas's ears. These were people he'd known for years, people he'd considered friends. Had they always been this way, or had he just been too blind to notice? "Actually," Thomas set his coffee cup down carefully, "Lyla has shared some of her family's history with me. It's been enlightening. Did you know her grandmother ran an underground school during segregation? That her mother organized unions to fight for basic worker rights?" "Thomas," Sarah's voice took on a patronizing tone, "you can't seriously be getting involved with all that. It's not our world. We have a responsibility to maintain certain standards." "Standards?" Thomas felt his temperature rising. Like ignoring inequality? Like pretending we succeeded purely on merit while others face barriers we can't even imagine. "Now you sound like one of those social justice warriors," Marcus sneered. "What happened to you, man? You used to understand how things work." "Maybe I'm finally starting to understand how things really work," Thomas replied. He stood up, no longer interested in maintaining the facade of a pleasant brunch. "And maybe it's time we all took a harder look at our assumptions." "If you keep this up," Sarah warned, "people will talk. It could affect your business relationships, your social standing. Then let them talk." Thomas looked around at the faces of his so-called friends, seeing clearly the comfortable bubble they all lived in. Maybe it's time for things to change. The group shifted uncomfortably, conversations dying into awkward silence. Thomas watched as his guests began making excuses to leave, their Sunday brunch cutting short by mutual unspoken agreement. As the last car pulled out of his driveway, Thomas found himself standing alone in his massive backyard. The perfectly manicured lawn, the Olympic-sized pool, the imported Italian furniture, all of it suddenly felt hollow. Inside, he could hear Lyla moving through the house, cleaning up after his guests. He thought about how many brunches she'd quietly worked through, listening to conversations like today's, maintaining her dignity in silence. Thomas pulled out his phone and looked at the donation form he'd filled out for the community center. The amount he'd chosen suddenly seemed insufficient. Not because throwing money at the problem would solve everything, but because he now understood this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. He'd lost something today, the comfortable ignorance that had allowed him to move through life without questioning his place in it. But he'd gained something too: clarity, purpose, and the unsettling but necessary understanding that real change would require more than just writing checks. It would require facing uncomfortable truths, losing fair-weather friends, and potentially risking the very privilege he'd taken for granted for so long. Looking at Lila's necklace gleaming in the sunlight through the window, Thomas realized he was ready to accept those consequences. Thomas found Lyla in his home studio one morning, standing before an unused canvas. She hadn't noticed him in the doorway, and for a moment, he watched as she traced the air in front of the blank surface with her finger, as if painting invisible strokes. "Do you paint?" he asked, causing her to jump slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry. I was just dusting," and Lyla, he interrupted gently. "You don't need to apologize. Do you paint?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I used to, before I had to start working full-time." Thomas stepped into the studio, looking at it with fresh eyes. He'd bought all this equipment years ago, thinking he'd take up painting as a hobby. Like his home gym and wine cellar, it had become just another unused status symbol. "Show me," he said, gesturing to the canvas. "Oh no, I couldn't, please," he insisted, pulling out his rarely used collection of paints and brushes. "I'd like to see." Lyla stood still for a long moment, then slowly approached the canvas. She selected a brush, tested its weight in her hand, and began to paint. Thomas watched in amazement as colors flowed onto the canvas with confident strokes. She worked quickly, as if afraid the opportunity might be taken away. The image that emerged was striking, a pair of hands, weathered and strong, holding the liberation pendant. The hands seemed to tell their own story, each wrinkle and scar rendered with careful attention. "That's incredible," Thomas said softly when she finally stepped back. "How long have you been painting?" "Since I was a child. My mother encouraged it, even when we could barely afford food. She'd bring home discarded paper from her cleaning jobs, find bits of charcoal from construction sites." Lila's voice grew distant with memory. "Art was my escape, my way of processing everything happening around me." Thomas studied the painting. "You should have a showing." "A showing?" Lyla laughed, but it held an edge of bitterness. "Who will want to see my work?" "Everyone." Thomas was already forming plans. "We could use the community center, create an event that showcases not just your art, but the stories behind it. The community's history, its struggles and triumphs." "Mr. Caldwell?" "Thomas," he corrected. "Mr. Caldwell," she insisted. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not looking for charity." "This isn't charity," he replied firmly. "This is recognition of talent, of important stories that need to be told. Will you at least think about it?" She touched her necklace, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of gathering strength. "I'll think about it." Over the next few weeks, Thomas watched as Lyla began spending her breaks in the studio. She worked efficiently through her cleaning duties, then would disappear into the art room. Each painting told a different story. Children playing double dutch on cracked sidewalks, elderly women singing on church steps, protest signs held high against gray skies. The transformation in Lyla was subtle but unmistakable. She stood straighter, spoke more freely, let her passion show through when discussing her work. Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations about art and meaning, about color choices and composition, about the stories behind each piece. "My grandmother would have loved this," she said one afternoon, working on a painting of the community center's mural. "She always said art was a way of keeping history alive." She was right, Thomas replied. Studying the way, she captured the determination in the painted figures' faces. "These aren't just paintings, they're documents, testimonies." Word of Lila's art began to spread through the community center. Dr. Wilson visited the studio, bringing with him old photographs that sparked new paintings. Young people from the center's after-school program started dropping by, watching in awe as Lyla transformed blank canvases into windows to the past. "The exhibition space at the center will need work," Thomas said one day, reviewing renovation plans. "But we can have it ready in 2 months." Lyla paused in her painting, a scene of her mother addressing a crowd of workers. "I still haven't said yes to the showing." "I know," Thomas smiled. "But when you do, we'll be ready." She looked at him for a long moment, then returned to her work. But Thomas noticed she was hiding a small smile. The studio became more than just a room in his mansion. It became a bridge between worlds. Sometimes, when he passed by and heard Lyla explaining a painting to visiting community members, Thomas would stand quietly in the hallway, listening to stories of struggle and resilience, of pain and triumph, of a history he was only beginning to understand. Each painting was an education, each story a reminder of how much he still had to learn. And in Lyla's growing confidence, in the way she now moved through his house, not as a servant, but as an artist, Thomas saw the first real evidence that change was possible, that bridges could be built, that understanding could grow from the most unexpected places. The community center's exhibition space had been transformed. Fresh paint covered the walls, new lighting illuminated each carefully hung piece, and the old linoleum floor had been polished until it shone. Thomas stood back, surveying the space as people began to arrive for the opening. Lyla's paintings lined the walls chronologically, telling the story of her community from the civil rights era to the present. The centerpiece was her first painting from Thomas's studio, those weathered hands holding the liberation pendant, now accompanied by a photograph of her grandmother wearing the actual necklace. "Quite a turnout," Dr. Wilson commented, joining Thomas near the entrance. The space was filling quickly with an unusual mix of people. Community members, art critics alerted by Thomas's connections, and even a few curious faces from his former social circle. "She deserves it," Thomas replied, watching Lyla speak with a group of elderly women who were pointing at a painting of their younger selves singing on church steps. A sleek figure in an expensive suit approached them, and Thomas recognized Xavier Reynolds, a prominent gallery owner known for discovering new artists. Thomas had deliberately not invited him, but news of the exhibition had spread. "Thomas Caldwell," Xavier extended his hand. "I had no idea you were involved in the community art scene." His tone suggested he found the whole thing quaint. "Your housekeeper's work is interesting. Very raw, very ethnic. There could be a market for this sort of thing." "Her name is Lyla Johnson," Thomas corrected firmly. "And she's not my housekeeper tonight. She's the artist." Of course, Xavier smiled smoothly. "Listen, I have some collectors who eat up this sort of authentic struggle narrative. With the right marketing, proper packaging, I could make her work very profitable. For everyone involved." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "These aren't commodities, Mr. Reynolds. They're stories, lives, history. Everything's a commodity if you market it right," Xavier insisted. "Look, I'll be direct. I'm offering to represent her. Exclusive contract, my usual terms. We clean up her image a bit, craft the right backstory. Her story doesn't need crafting," Thomas interrupted. "And she doesn't need your kind of representation." Xavier's smile turned cold. "You're making a mistake. Without proper guidance, this little community project will be forgotten by next week. I'm offering her a real chance at success." "Success isn't always measured in dollars," Thomas said, thinking of how far he'd come from his own materialistic mindset. "And Lyla's work will be remembered because it matters, not because it's marketed." "I see." Xavier's voice dripped with condescension. "You've gone native, haven't you? Playing G. White's savior to the help? How perfectly predictable." Before Thomas could respond, Lyla's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" She stood beside them, radiating quiet dignity in her simple black dress, the liberation pendant gleaming at her throat. "Ms. Johnson," Xavier turned on the charm, "I was just discussing your wonderful potential with Mr. Caldwell. I'd love to talk about representation." "I heard what you were discussing," Lyla interrupted calmly. "And I'm not interested in being your token diversity artist." "Now, let's not be hasty. My art isn't for sale," Lyla continued. "These paintings stay here, in the community where they belong. They're not meant for private collections or carefully curated galleries. They're meant to be seen by the people whose stories they tell." Xavier's facade cracked slightly. "You're making a serious mistake. Both of you." He glanced between them. "This little community project won't advance your career. You need my connections, my expertise. What I need," Lyla said firmly, "is to honor these stories properly. And that's exactly what we're doing here." The gallery owner opened his mouth to argue further, but something in Lyla's expression made him think better of it. With a final disapproving look, he turned and walked away. "I'm proud of you," Thomas said quietly. For turning down a chance at success? Lyla asked, a slight edge to her voice. For knowing your own worth? Thomas corrected. For understanding that success can mean different things. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. A group of young students from the center's after-school program had arrived, their eyes wide as they took in the exhibition. One little girl pointed excitedly at a painting of children jumping rope. "That's my mama," she exclaimed. "Look, that's really my mama when she was little." Lyla smiled, touching her pendant. "Would you like to hear the story behind that painting?" she asked the children. They gathered around her eagerly as she began to explain how their parents and grandparents had found joy even in difficult times. Thomas watched as more people gathered to listen, drawn in by Lyla's quiet passion and the power of the stories she told. This, he realized, was real success, not measured in sales figures or gallery prestige, but in the way art could bridge generations, preserve history, and strengthen community bonds. The exhibition wasn't just about showing paintings. It was about reclaiming narrative control, about telling stories that needed to be told, about refusing to let those stories be commodified or sanitized for mass consumption. In refusing Xavier's offer, both Thomas and Lyla had chosen authenticity over commercial success, integrity over profit. The success of the exhibition lingered in the air like summer heat. In the weeks that followed, the community center saw increased visitors, donations, and interest in its programs. Lyla's paintings remained on display, becoming a permanent installation that drew people from across the city. Thomas found Lyla in the studio one morning, not painting but reading. A stack of college brochures lay spread across the work table. "Art programs," she said before he could ask, her fingers tracing the glossy pages of a course catalog. "The local university has evening classes." "That's wonderful," Thomas said, meaning it. He'd watched her talent bloom over the past months, seen how art had awakened something vital in her. "I've been saving," she continued, her voice careful. "Between my regular salary and the cleaning jobs I pick up on weekends, I might have enough for one class by next semester." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'll cover the tuition." Lyla's head snapped up, her expression hardening. "No, why not? You're talented, you deserve what I deserve," she interrupted, "is to do this on my own terms." She stood, gathering the brochures. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, Mr. Caldwell. The studio, the exhibition, your support. But I can't be in your debt." "It wouldn't be debt," Thomas protested. "It would be an investment in your future." "An investment implies ownership," Lyla said quietly. "Even a small piece of ownership. And I've spent too much of my life belonging to other people's houses, other people's schedules, other people's dreams." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Thomas thought about how their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something more complex, more equal. But there were still boundaries, still power dynamics they couldn't ignore. "I understand," he said finally, "but will you at least let me help you explore options? There might be scholarships, grants. I've already researched everything," Lyla said. "I know exactly what I need to do. I've been planning this since before the exhibition." She pulled out a carefully organized folder filled with scholarship applications, financial aid forms, and a detailed budget. Thomas recognized the same meticulous attention she brought to everything she did. "I'll need to cut back on my hours here," she added, "once classes start." "Of course," Thomas agreed quickly. "Whatever you need." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Thomas realized he'd grown accustomed to their daily conversations about art and life, the way she'd begun to share more of herself during their studio talks. "Will you still paint here?" he asked. "When you can." Lyla's expression softened slightly. "The studio has become important to me, but things will have to change. I can't be your housekeeper and an art student and everything else all at once." "You don't have to be my housekeeper at all," Thomas said. "I could. Stop." Lyla held up her hand. "This is exactly what I mean. You can't just sweep in and fix everything with money. That's not how real change works. That's not how real growth happens." Thomas felt the sting of truth in her words. Despite his journey of understanding, he still defaulted to solving problems with his wealth. "I need to do this myself," Lyla continued. "I need to know that every brush stroke, every canvas, every class is something I earned. Can you understand that? Looking at her standing there, the liberation pendant catching the morning light, Thomas saw not his housekeeper, but a woman claiming her own path. Her own future. I understand, he said quietly. But I hope you know that your talent, your voice, your stories, they've changed how I see everything. I'm not trying to own your dreams, Lyla. I just want to support them. Then support them by understanding why I need to do this my way, she replied. Support them by respecting my choices, even when they're not the choices you would make. Thomas nodded slowly. Will you at least keep me updated? Let me know how your classes are going. A small smile touched Lila's lips. I suppose I could do that. As friends, the word friends hung in the air, marking another shift in their evolving relationship. It wasn't the clean solution Thomas's wealth could have provided, but it was something more valuable, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than dependency. Lyla returned to organizing her applications, and Thomas watched her for a moment before leaving the studio. He had his own learning to do. He realized about supporting without controlling, about respecting boundaries, about understanding that sometimes the best help was simply stepping back and letting someone walk their own path. The box had been in Thomas's attic for decades, untouched since his mother's death 5 years ago. He'd never felt compelled to open it until now, but his conversation with Dr. Wilson about his father had awakened something, a need to understand. Dust scattered as he lifted the lid. Inside, he found stacks of old photographs, letters, and documents. His hands bled slightly as he began to sort through them. A newspaper clipping caught his eye, similar to the one Dr. Wilson had shown him, but different. This one showed his father, Henry Caldwell, standing with a group of protesters outside a segregated school. The date, 1965. His father would have been in his early 20s. I can help you with that. Thomas startled at Lila's voice. She stood in the attic doorway, a feather duster in hand. I didn't know you were here today, he said. Thursdays, remember? She approached carefully, looking at the scattered papers. May I? Thomas nodded, and she sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, handling the documents with the same care she showed her paintings. Look at this, she said, pulling out a letter written on faded paper. The return address was the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center. It's dated 1968. Thomas began to read aloud. Dear Henry, the threats are getting worse. I know you want to continue our work openly, but we need to think about protecting our families. Your son needs his father alive more than our cause needs another martyr. We can find other ways to fight. James Wilson, Lyla said quietly. Dr. Wilson. Thomas's hands shook as he reached for another letter, this one in his father's handwriting. My dearest Thomas, one day you'll be old enough to understand why I had to leave. The work we're doing is dangerous but necessary. Your mother agrees it's safer if you don't know the details. Just know that everything I do to make the world better for you and for all children. Love, Dad. The letter was never sent. More documents emerged. Photographs of his father at civil rights meetings, receipts for anonymous donations to the community center, newspaper clippings about suspicious fires at activists' homes. Your father was more than just a supporter, Lyla said, examining a photograph of Henry speaking at a rally. He was on the front lines. But why didn't he ever tell me? Thomas's voice cracked. Why disappear completely? Sometimes silence is protection, Lyla replied, touching her pendant. My grandmother used to tell me stories about those days. White allies who openly supported the movement often faced brutal retaliation. Their families were targeted. Thomas found another letter, this one from his mother. Henry, I understand why you have to stay away, but Thomas asks about you every day. I tell him you love him, that you had important work to do. Someday, when it's safer, please come back to us. He needs to know his father's heart. Always, Margaret, she knew, Thomas whispered. All those years, she knew where he was, what he was doing. She was protecting you both, Lyla said. Like my grandmother protected my mother, like my mother protected me. Thomas picked up another photograph. His father standing with a group of community leaders, including a woman wearing a liberation pendant identical to Lila's. That's my grandmother, Lyla said softly, pointing to the woman. They worked together. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His father and Lila's grandmother had stood side by side, fighting the same battles, sharing the same risks. All these years later, their children's paths had crossed, carrying forward a connection neither of them knew existed. "There's more," Lyla said, pulling out a thick folder labeled Community Center Foundation documents. Inside, they found the original deed to the center's land, purchased anonymously through a series of shell companies. The final owner's name, Henry Caldwell. He didn't just help found the center, Thomas realized. He made sure it would always have a home. "And now you're helping to preserve it," Lyla added, without even knowing you were continuing his work. Thomas sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of history in his hands. His father hadn't abandoned them. He'd chosen to fight for a better world, even at the cost of his own happiness. "He's still alive," Thomas said suddenly. "Dr. Wilson knows where he is, doesn't he?" Lyla nodded slowly. "I think many people at the center know. They've been protecting him, and you, all these years." Thomas gathered the documents carefully, each piece now precious beyond measure. "I need to find him, not to confront him, but to understand, to thank him." "Understanding takes courage," Lyla said, rising to her feet. "Are you ready for what you might learn?" Thomas looked at the photograph of his father and Lila's grandmother, at the determination in their faces, at the shared purpose that had unknowingly shaped both their lives. "Yes," he said firmly, "I'm ready to know the truth." The community center's main hall hummed with anticipation. Vintage photographs and newspaper clippings covered the walls, documenting decades of struggle and triumph. At the center of it all hung a large banner, honoring our heroes, past and present. Thomas stood at the podium, adjusting his microphone. The crowd before him represented a cross-section of history. Elderly civil rights veterans, current community activists, young students from the center's programs, and even a few faces from his old social circle who had begun to understand. "Tonight," he began, "we gather to honor those who fought and continue to fight for justice. Some worked in the spotlight, while others operated in the shadows. All of them risked everything for what they believed in." His eyes found Lyla in the front row. She wore her grandmother's pendant proudly, its surface catching the light just as it had the day he first noticed it in his guest room. "Many of you know Lyla Johnson as an artist," Thomas continued. "Her recent exhibition opened our eyes to stories that needed telling. But tonight, we also honor her family's legacy. Her grandmother, Margaret Johnson, wore a liberation pendant as she taught children in secret schools. Her mother organized workers and fought for their rights. And Lyla herself carries forward their spirit of resistance and dignity." Lyla stood as the crowd applauded, her usual composure touched by emotion as Dr. Wilson presented her with a Community Service Award. But Thomas wasn't finished. "We also gathered to recognize others who contributed to this community struggle. Some names you know, others have remained hidden. Tonight, we bring one such name into the light." A murmur ran through the crowd as Thomas pulled out the photographs and documents they'd discovered in his attic. "My father, Henry Caldwell, disappeared from my life when I was young. For years, I thought he had abandoned us. Now I know he was here all along, fighting alongside many of you, choosing to stay in the shadows to protect his family while working for change." The room grew very quiet. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down. He helped found the center, secured its future, and supported countless initiatives that improved lives. Thomas's voice caught as he saw movement at the back of the hall. An elderly man had stood up, his face lined with years, but his eyes sharp and clear. The crowd parted as he began walking toward the podium. "Dad!" Thomas whispered, forgetting the microphone was still on. Henry Caldwell moved slowly but deliberately, his gaze never leaving his son's face. The room held its collective breath. Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "Henry has been our silent guardian for over 50 years. He's attended every major event in this center, watching from the back, making sure his work continued. Today, he finally comes forward." Thomas stepped down from the podium, meeting his father halfway. They stood face to face, decades of absence between them. "I wanted to tell you so many times," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone, I was there, in the background, watching you grow. I know why you stayed away." Thomas replaced. "IED. I found your letters. I understand now." The two men embraced as the crowd erupted in applause. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. Lyla approached them, her pendant gleaming. "Mr. Caldwell," she said to Henry, "my grandmother spoke of you often, though she never used your real name. She said there were angels among us, working in secret." Henry reached out and touched the pendant gently. "Margaret was the real hero. All of us who worked in secret, we just provided support. The real courage was in those who faced the danger openly, wearing these pendants as badges of honor." "And now?" Thomas asked. "Now that the truth is out?" Henry looked around the hall, at the faces of people he'd worked alongside in secret for so long. "Now we make sure these stories are never forgotten, that the next generation understands both the visible and invisible battles that brought us here." Dr. Wilson joined them, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Perhaps it's time for new stories too. Stories of healing, of understanding, of bridges built between worlds that seemed forever separated." Thomas started to respond, but stopped as he noticed something strange in the crowd. A familiar face that seemed out of place in this setting. His heart began to race as he realized what he was seeing. But before he could speak, the face in the crowd belonged to Xavier Reynolds, the gallery owner who had tried to commercialize Lyla's art. But he wasn't there to cause trouble. The expression on his face was different, vulnerable, almost haunted. "Henry," Xavier called out, his usual polished demeanor cracking. "Henry Caldwell." Henry turned, squinting at the man approaching them. Recognition dawned slowly on his weathered face. "Little Xavier?" Henry's voice softened. "Margaret Reynolds, boy." Thomas looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Xavier Reynolds, the same man who had dismissed Lyla's art as a commodity to be exploited, had some connection to all this? "My mother," Xavier said, his voice unsteady. "She wore a pendant too. She worked with your father, Thomas, with Lyla's grandmother. But when the threats got bad enough, she made different choices. She took me away, changed our name, tried to forget." He pulled something from his pocket, a liberation pendant, tarnished with age and neglect. "She gave me this on her deathbed last month, made me promise to return it to the community where it belonged. I've been trying to find the courage to do it ever since." He looked at Lyla. "When I saw your art, saw your pendant, I reacted badly. It was easier to treat it all as a commodity than to face what I'd walked away from." The revelation rippled through the room. Here was another hidden story, another thread in the complex tapestry of their shared history. Henry stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Xavier's shoulder. "Margaret Reynolds was one of the bravest women I knew. She made her choice to protect you, just as I made mine to protect Thomas. There's no shame in that. But I became everything we fought against," Xavier said bitterly. "I built my career selling art to the wealthy, treating creativity as a product, dismissing the very communities my mother once fought for." "Then change," Lyla said simply, touching her pendant. "It's never too late to honor your mother's legacy, to reclaim your own history." Thomas watched as something shifted in Xavier's expression. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated gallery owner crumbled, revealing the lost son beneath. "The center could use someone with your expertise," Thomas suggested. "Not to commercialize our stories, but to help preserve them, to help young artists find their voice without losing their soul." Xavier looked around the hall, at the photographs documenting the struggle, at the faces of those who had lived it, at the young people carrying it forward. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like tea. Oh, come home." Dr. Wilson stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "This is what healing looks like. This is what happens when we bring our whole truth into the light. Every time we think we know the full story, another layer reveals itself." Thomas stood in the center of it all, watching as these different threads of history wove themselves together. His father, no longer a painful absence, but a quiet hero. Lyla, not just his housekeeper, but an artist and keeper of stories. Xavier, transforming from antagonist to another lost child, finding his way back to his roots. The pendants were never just jewelry, Henry said, looking at the 3 liberation pendants now present in the room. Lyla's shining bright with daily wear, Xavier's tarnished with years of hiding, and the third, revealed now on a chain around Henry's neck. They were promises, promises that the truth would survive, that justice would prevail, that our children would know who they really were. And now, Thomas asked, looking at these symbols of resistance that had brought them all together. Now, Lyla answered, we make new promises. To remember the past without being trapped by it. To fight old battles in new ways. To recognize that every story of struggle carries seeds of redemption. The evening stretched on, filled with more revelations, more connections discovered, more bridges built. Thomas watched as Xavier shared memories of his mother with Henry, as Lyla spoke with young artists about authentic expression, as different generations and communities found common ground in their shared history. And through it all, the liberation pendants caught the light, their surfaces reflecting not just the past, but the possibility of a future where understanding replaced ignorance, where healing overcame division, where truth set everyone free. In the end, Thomas realized this wasn't just a story about a wealthy man discovering his conscience, or about a housekeeper reclaiming her voice. It was about the countless invisible threads that connect us all, the secrets that shape us, and the courage it takes to look honestly at who we are and who we might become. As the evening wound down, Thomas found himself back where it all began, looking at Lila's pendant, seeing not just jewelry, but a key that had unlocked doors he never knew existed. The last light of day streamed through the center's windows, catching all three pendants at once. And for a moment, their combined glow seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the path forward. A path they would walk together, carrying their shared history into a future bright with possibility.